17th century, the Baroque era, and the 18th century, the Age of Reason, the era of the Enlightenment, were both the eras during which politics had this very clear tendency to grow more and more serious, more scientifically based, less religiously motivated, for instance. More concerned with real political facts, with real needs and interests of states, of rulers, of peoples, and less on the Christian ideology. Mainly Christian, because we are limited. Now we limit ourselves, of course, to the European hemisphere, because the intercultural contacts were so they were so unfrequent, and the cultures like China or India and so on had no real chance to influence the European culture, and the other way around. So we concentrate ourselves on Europe, of course, and we are talking now about European policy of the 17th and 18th century. There were some authors that changed the whole attitude to politics, both national and international, like Niccolo Machiavelli, who all his statements about all his political concepts based on the real observation of the Florentine Republic, of the other Italian states, and also several other European states like Germany and France. And he liberated the whole political discourse from the religious elements, the elements of religious belief and so on. And he was, of course, very severely criticized for that. Many rulers also did criticize him, but secretly, at the same time, they were secretly reading what he wrote, and very much influenced by the book Il Principe by Machiavelli. And the good indicator of the change is the end of the great medieval popularity of crusades, whereas in the Middle Ages the many rulers and knights were highly attracted to the concept of crusades, of fighting Turks for Christianity in the so-called Holy Land. In the 17th century it's not so popular anymore. Although the papacy continued to encourage those missions, those wars on Turks. And when we speak about seriousness, of the growing seriousness of those states, we can say a few words about of course, the authors like Machiavelli, the authors more, well, idealistic authors like, I don't know, Thomas More, for instance, that tried to create the model for the perfect utopia, for the perfect state, like I don't know, Plato like Plato did in the ancient times. So it was the Renaissance spirit to make politics a science, like Aristotle or Plato wanted, and not the matter of salvation and so on anymore. And so the ideology were growing more serious, and also the states, the whole organization, the political reality grew more serious. When we see about the ambassadors, about about the stable missions, about that, it is a very clear tendency already in the 17th century in Europe, in Western Europe, that the ambassadors were residing all the time in other countries' capitals, whereas previously the missions were, well, organized from time to time. So, and this is also the very interesting indicator as far as Russia is concerned, and this points out the whole process of joining Europe by Russia, by the Tsars, in the early 18th century, when we observe the first Russian residents working all the time in other countries' capitals for Russian government, and this was something new for Russia. And in 17th century, in early 17th century, it was something new for most Western European countries as well. So we have these stable residents, we have the whole concepts of the work that the ambassador is supposed to do. Like we have this very famous sentence that the ambassador is the legal spy. This is the ambassador is the person that lies for his ruler, for his country, for his country's good, of course. So this was also to some extent a matter of the new approach towards morality, towards the moral issues and so on. This, of course, for instance, when I mentioned that Machiavelli was criticized but secretly read at the same time, the same we can say about the whole the group of other authors writing about politics and diplomacy, like for instance the Abraham de Viquefort, that wrote several books on diplomacy and on the ambassador's work in the late 17th century. A great number of books about the ambassador's work and diplomacy, international politics, and as well as internal policies that we can observe in 17th and 18th centuries. It's something very new. It was a new phenomenon. It's the sign of growing seriousness of the states and of international politics. We can, of course, there were many interesting authors writing about the topic. The aforementioned Viquefort, the Bunkers-Hoek, the other Dutch author, who was publishing his works in the first half of the 18th century. Many of those names I can mention are Dutch, because Dutch diplomacy, alongside the French and Venetian diplomacy in the 17th century, was considered one of the best. It altered a little bit in the 18th century with the rise of the British power in Europe, in Prussian power, and the collapse of the Spanish and to some extent also French political influence in Europe, the hegemony of those countries. First the Spanish hegemony, and then the French one. I have already mentioned about the awareness of the Russians in the first half of the 18th century about these changes in attitudes towards politics. That there were these resident ambassadors of Russia living in London, Paris and so on, already in the first half of the 18th century. There was the exact opposite situation we have in Poland, when this change was not well respected, and the Polish authors like Herakliusz Lubomirski, in his book in 1702, published in 1702, he stated that if the if the state has peaceful intentions, then it need no ambassadors, no diplomats really. So it was very stupid statement, because the small countries that wanted to live peacefully between in the sea of among the whole concert of more powerful nations like the Dutch Republic, usually tried to create a very good diplomacy and very good institutions and so on to cope with this delicate situation. Poland did the exact opposite. So it's no wonder that in 1770s and 1790s we had the partitions of Poland, because the reforms of Poniatowski's reign that started in 1764 were not enough to alter the situation. So for this not keeping abreast with time, Poland was punished by partitions, by the three neighboring states, Prussia, Russia and Austria. We can also see the example of, we must remember that Poland was in those times, in the time in the Union with Saxony, so the Polish political elite could to some extent rely on the Saxon diplomats. But it was not enough, and when the Union was broken, then the situation was really serious. So it was the call of the time to have a good diplomacy, to have representatives in other countries' capitals and so on. We can also observe a very interesting case in Portugal, whose diplomats in 18th century, like Luis da Cunha, were very much interested in the way the British and the other leading states were conducting their business and defending their interests on the international scene. And Luis da Cunha realized that much depends on diplomacy, much depends also on the shape and on the concept of economy. He learned on this stuff in Britain when he was a Portuguese ambassador from 1712 to 1714 or 13, 1712 to 1714, for a year in ambassador in London. And he was very much interested in this British entrepreneurial spirit. He accused the Portuguese state of the politics, of the destructive policy of intolerance towards the so-called new Christians, who were the descendants of the Jews and Muslims that stayed in Portugal, but went and accepted Christianity, converted to Christianity many years ago, many years earlier. It was in the 15th century or so, but were treated by the legal system still as inferior, somewhat inferior to the old Christians. He also accused Portugal of the of having too much monks and priests, that is, the people who economically are usually inactive. So it was also a very bad factor. And for the Portuguese international politics, and he was very much interested in this, how the British tried to have modern diplomacy. And so we can see that there was still a problem to make a decent realpolitik in the 18th century, You can also mention the conflict that lasted for many years between the two leading ministers of the King Ferdinand VI of Spain. The conflict was in the 40s and 1740s and 1750s. And this was the conflict between two visions of politics. The one, the conservative Christian vision of the Christian prince that should make politics and internal policy also as it should be morally, and the other was this realpolitik version, the Machiavellian version, that accepted politics, the political reality as it was, and was called for adapting to the situation and using it to defend the goals of a state and so on, and the interest of the state and so on. So the major proponent of the first vision, of the Christian conservative moral vision, was Jose Carvajal y Lancaster, and the other, the proponent, the main representative and his main opponent was the very much Machiavellian Marquis de Ensenada. And it's a very interesting example of how hard it was to accept the rules of realpolitik for some politicians and some elites in the 18th century. The other novelty we can observe in international politics and diplomacy in the 17th and 18th century is the concept of immunity of an ambassador. Sometimes it was not respected, like in case of Karl Gyllenborg in 1717. Gyllenborg was ambassador of Sweden in London, and he was engaged in Jacobean and Swedish. Well, it was the action of the English Jacobites, the Scottish Jacobites, the English Jacobites, of course, as well, and the Sweden and supported by Sweden and Spain. It was directed against the new royal dynasty of Great Britain, that is the Hanoverian dynasty, and Gyllenborg, as almost the whole Swedish diplomats of that time, was engaged in this project, and he was arrested as a threat to the British state in 1770. So the house in which the embassy was situated was invaded, and he was then caught by the guards and arrested. But it was a very rare example of not respecting the ambassador's immunity in the 17th and 18th century. So we can say that the politics and diplomacy of that time was growing more serious also as far as the immunity and as far as the function of an ambassador is concerned. But apart from this very particular situation in which the diplomatic apparatus of one country was used to subvert the royal dynasty, the political power in the other country, which was really something beyond normal international politics and diplomacy, we can say, we must say that in 17th and 18th century the person and function of ambassador was universally respected, and maybe comparatively to our present times, but maybe even more than today, because as all the high officials from that era, the ambassadors were and envoys, they recruited from the aristocratic elites, so they were naturally seen as something superior to the normal mob and so on. But apart from this realistic concept of politics and diplomacy and internal policy, and we have also several examples of more idealistic approach. We have, of course, the whole Christian values were a little bit lost, not a little bit, lost much of its credit during the religious wars of the 16th century, and it was also the time when the humanist new concepts emerged that were somehow connected to the ancient ones, and this new representatives of the representatives of these new ideas like Montaigne or Machiavelli had to confront the very old problem, the problem that we can see already in the ancient Greek tragedies, ancient Greek dramas. For instance, the problem was whether to make people better or to present them in art, in dramas, in tragedies, exactly as they are, as feeble and as mischievous and so on. So to make them decent, because to teach them morals, or to present them exactly as they were. So when I mentioned Carvajal y Lancaster, for instance, he was an example of a politician that still took very seriously the Christian ideals. When I mentioned Ensenada, I mentioned the Machiavellian politician who wanted to make the realpolitik without any moral issues involved. But the only moral issue he was interested in was the interest of the state and of his monarch and so on. There's also somehow moral attitude, but still. And we have also the third option, the third attitude present in those times. We have the new humanist visions to make world better through and thanks to the constant contact between and constant discourse between the states. So the concepts that were presented were a little bit had a much resemblance to the today's United Nations or something. So we can say that they were quite a group of thinkers that presented the projects of the international republic of the countries that were resolving their problems through discussions constantly and through other arrangements. The first we can mention is the Count of Sully. He was then advisor, counselor to the French King Henry IV, and he invented a model of a republic of several European countries, which was based more or less on the balance of their powers and the other arrangements. The very similar project was William Penn's, one of the Quaker leaders. the Anglo-American Quaker leader William Penn, he also presented a very similar project. We can also mention Charles Castel de Saint-Pierre. He was a French courtier in the first half of the 18th century, so his vision emerged later than those of Sully and Penn. And his idea was to give every country in Europe the equal chances to be dangerous or not dangerous to other nations. It was totally utopian idea to give every country 6,000 troops, 6,000 soldiers for the defense. So I think no country would ever accept something like this. It would be very, very low number for powerful countries, but it would be relatively fair for the small countries, and they would probably agree for something like this. And this vision was very much praised, very much praised by Immanuel Kant, who in the second half of the 18th century presented the work Zum ewigen Frieden, to eternal peace, when he based his vision of the eternal peace between nations on the universal appreciation of freedom and the universal appreciation of liberal values he stood for. So because when we talk about the 18th century, we talk about mainly about Enlightenment, and the biggest, the more important branch of this movement we call today Enlightenment, that is the pre-liberalism. So Kant was one of the most important representatives of this ideology. Kant was of an opinion, not very rare between the intellectual elites of the 18th century, that the better people are, the more mature intellectually and morally people are, the better the whole future political situation in Europe will be. So Kant, as one of the leading figures of the Enlightenment period, he perceived Enlightenment and something like maturing, right? Like making people more mature, more independent. So he was of an opinion that every person should be treated as a mature person. She should not be supervised by religious or political elites all the time, but should be given some space, some free space to pursue his own dreams and ends. So Kant's idea was one of the new liberal ideas, one of the versions of the early liberalism. We will return to liberalism a little bit later, but we can say a few words about Huig de Groot, who is more known by his Latinized name, Grotius, who lived in the early 17th century, and he has written a book, or to be precise, several books about the international law. he is today perceived as one of the creators of the international law. One of his most important observations was that countries should need a form of international law, because he stated that that war is not natural. It's not natural for countries to lead wars against one another. So, if it's not natural, we must perceive wars as something like an aberration, something not natural. So, if something is if something is not natural, we must bring it again to the natural form. So, if there are wars, and wars are not natural, natural is peace, we must have law to make wars as harmless as possible, so as civilized as possible. So de Groot was the inventor of the international law. He was also inventor of the idea that all seas should be open to shipping of every nation. So this concept was called mare liberum, and maybe he was an advocate of freedom of the seas, because the Dutch commercial fleet was the most efficient and most developed in those times, whereas the British, the English, because it was before the union with Scotland, so it was up to 1707 it was England, and then it was Britain. So de Groot was an advocate of the freedom of the seas, of the free access to all the seas. So, and whereas the John Selden, the Englishman, was of an opinion that all seas should be as divided as the main among different states. So it should be treated exactly like a land territory. And this vision was called by him mare clausum, closed sea. The liberals, the early liberals of the 18th century, adopted many of de Groot's ideas of freedom of the seas and of peace as a natural state of human human and of state and natural state, and war something like an illness. This has opened the new gate to new forms of political idealism, this time based on liberal virtues, not Christian or conservative virtues as it was previously. And also very important was the individualism, and that is the base of every liberalism, and that the state should also be caring about the individual and enabling him to live a happy life. That was also something new, because before that the person has only duties and not rights, not human rights. So it's also everything gets the effect of some Renaissance and liberal concepts. The concept of various Enlightenment thinkers differed but there was the universal claim that the ruler cannot do anything about his subjects, and he should respect their individual rights. It manifested itself in every branch of human experience during this era of enlightenment. For instance, in the historiography, August Schlützer, a German historian, condemned the previous way of writing history, condemned the previous historiography as Mordgeschichte, the crime history that was concerned only in the action of rulers, which actions were sometimes very cruel, and didn't even mention the everyman, the needs of the people, and so on. So the same was in politics. Many thinkers of the era of enlightenment were of an opinion that if science be promoted in the future time, then the people will be more mature, and then the age of eternal peace will be very close and will become. So that opinion was formed by Immanuel Kant, of course, but also by Jean Caritat Marquis de Condorcet, the father of the modern concept of progress, and many other representants of the Enlightenment movement. If we can call it a movement, it's more like a period in which there were many opinions manifested publicly, and so there were different opinions about how universal these concepts of good governing supported and advocated by Enlightenment can be. For instance, Montesquieu was often represented the minority of the thinkers of that era when stated that the form of government depends on the climate and the national character. First the climate, then the national character, then the form of government. Voltaire, for instance, and the majority of the liberal thinkers of that era were of the opinion that the English government, slightly modernized, maybe not modernized, maybe slightly improved English government, which was in fact also proposed by Montesquieu, who stated that the competition between two powers, the legislative, the legislature and the executive, is very good to form some sphere of liberty for the subjects, the citizens. But he was of an opinion that this English government is not for everyone, it's not for every culture, not for every country, and not for every nation. Voltaire was hesitating if better is the enlightened despot that encourages that embrace the liberal ideology, but still has the absolute power, claims to absolute power, and it does not share this power with some legislative, or maybe the English government with two powers, the legislative and the monarchical power, operating more or less on the same level, which is best. But there were also some old factors still present in the politics of the 17th and 18th centuries. For instance, of course, the treaties were signed between states and between other different states, and as they were before, the particular ways of thinking about politics also remained. For instance, the British concept of balance of power that consisted in supporting the power which cannot reach like hegemony on the continent in the period of interest, and always support the weaker power to avoid the hegemony of the stronger one, even if this stronger one is only temporarily stronger. Also, this whole British attitude to have the eternal interests, but no eternal allies. It's that remained, because as an isle, Britain is so isolated that can afford to build such international politics. Whereas, for instance, the Dutch Republic was not able to do so, and always seeked to have stable eternal allies, and that's why the many misunderstandings between London and The Hague took place in the 17th and 18th century. Even in the 18th century, those two countries were mostly allies. The 17th and 18th century was the period in which almost all governments established standing armies, which were usually very big comparing to the economic power of those states, and it's even considered to have this tendency of having a big standing army is even considered one of the factors that led to a revolution at the end in Europe, in France, and then in whole Europe at the end of the 18th century, because they were so costly, and its subsistence was so expensive. But the big standing armies were the necessity, because after introducing the gunpowder in the 16th centuries, no fortress could be safe anymore. So the politics was also growing more grew more and more serious, also because the rulers had to play more active role in international politics, because counting simply on defense powers were not enough anymore. And we can also mention the impact of mercantilism, which also had a huge impact on many wars and caused many wars, because mercantilism consisted in one, among other, the mercantilist assumed that then when one country gains some more economical prosperity and economical possibilities, then the other countries must lose the same amount of points, the same. One gains exactly as much as the other country loses, and the other way around. So mercantilism was very was a concept that cost many wars. For instance, Louis XIV started many of 2 wars against the Dutch Republic because he was convinced that when the Dutch commerce is so very prosperous, he must eventually lose, and because the basic basic lesson of capitalism, of free trade, was not yet learned, that the economy can grow as a whole and nobody loses then. One can gain more than the other, but there is a possibility that no one will lose. So we can also remember about this mercantilistic outlook, mercantilistic approach to economy in those times. And when we are comparing the 17th century and 18th century and the concepts of international security that emerged in those times with today's concepts.